This episode of the podcast is brought to you by our friends at Regrow, the premier cloud-based cannabis supply chain management system.
If you're a cannabis company searching for a strategic business partner to help you automate your business, scale effectively, and make the supply chain work for you, then you need to know about Regrow. Regrow is the first of its kind software that leverages components of leading ERP and supply chain systems with the necessary compliance of the cannabis industry. That's right, you'll get all aspects of regulatory compliance built in, with the added value of workforce management, inventory, SOP management, and reporting and metrics that allow for companies to scale successfully. So stop using the whiteboards, spreadsheets, and email to manage your cultivation, distribution, and manufacturing processes, and instead incorporate Regrow. Visit their website at regrow.io. That's regrow.io. Regrow, the premier cloud-based cannabis supply chain management system. Hello, my fellow people of the plant. In this episode of Cannabinoid Connect, I'm talking to Brooke Butler. She's the VP of Partnerships at Simplifya. Brooke is an energetic professional who has spent the last decade building her career across 4 continents before returning to the US to help grow Simplifya. Before joining Simplifya, Brooke headed up the local offices as the country director for global research and publishing firm Oxford Business Group. Her greatest desire is to help ensure that any cannabis business setting out to operate in the legal market has a chance to thrive in this highly regulated industry. Simplifya is the leading regulatory and operational compliance software platform that serves the cannabis industry. During our conversation, we discussed Brooke's background and how she joined Simplifya, the importance of cannabis compliance and the difficulties that operators face state by state, as well as the high barriers to entry and onerous regulations that affect businesses operating in the legal market. We also discuss tools that Simplifya provides to help companies stay compliant. So I hope you enjoy as you watch or listen to this episode of Cannabinoid Connect. Brooke Butler, what is going on?
Woo, glad to be here. Just
Thanks.
living that, day-to-day life in Denver and fighting off the internet gods to make sure I could join your podcast.
I was gonna say the Wi-Fi struggle is real in Denver the past 2 days for you. Before we recorded, you were telling us that you've been offline at the home.
It's been wild. Like it's on and off during the day, and I have gone from my sister's house to my house to our office, and it's like as soon as I leave my house, it's working at my sister's. I get there, and then it's not working at her house, and then I have to go back to another place. Working from parking lots. I worked from a grocery store parking lot yesterday for 2 hours and stole their Wi-Fi. So it kicked back on just in time for you though. So it was meant to be.
It was meant to be. We made it happen. I'm so glad we did too, because like we also talked about before we recorded, we've had exchanges on Twitter. I see that you're very active within the MSO gang and just spreading the good word and advocacy of cannabis. So great to meet you in person. Really excited to be talking with you, Brooke. Before we jump into your role as VP of Partnerships at Simplifya, you have built your career for the past decade in 4 different continents. Is that right?
Yeah. So I'm a bit of a wild card. Excuse me. I actually for over a decade spent time working in developing countries or emerging countries, doing really nerdy macroeconomic research for this British consulting company that would produce these macroeconomic like investment guides that we would sell to multinational corporations that were looking to invest in places that they didn't want to send their own people to do the research themselves on. So I lived in places like Nigeria for 3 years, in Sri Lanka for nearly 2, the Philippines, Malaysia, Dubai, Kuwait, like Colombia a little bit, like all these kind of crazy places.
That's incredible. So wait, let me get this straight. You were tasked with going to these countries as basically like a consultant to gather research and information to then bring back to whom and for what? Like for them to invest in these areas or buy them or what?
Yeah, so we were trying to help, I guess, do 2 things. One, we were trying to help, let's say, the country of Nigeria get the word out that, one, it's not as scary of a place as people would think if you don't know. But two, tried to outline and, what the investment opportunities were. If you're Del Monte and you're like, I want to open a banana farm in Nigeria, like, what are the challenges I would face? What are the opportunities I would face? And
what a cool job. That is amazing.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. So you basically got to learn the ins and outs of those areas from, like you said, that macroeconomic perspective. That's fascinating.
It was awesome. I got to meet, I don't know, a dozen world leaders, presidents of countries, very interesting business leaders. I actually didn't know that who Eric Schmidt was. He was the chairman of Google at the time, and took a selfie for him at the World Economic Forum. Like, just weird stories like that I have. But it was a really wild and fun decade.
Just some random guy asking you to take a selfie. You had no idea it's Eric Schmidt.
I had no idea. I did. As soon as I saw his name badge, like 30 seconds later, and I was just like frozen. I was like, oh my gosh.
That's so cool. That's awesome. Okay, so you're spending your time doing that, man. That's really cool, and I'm sure you learned a lot in that whole process. And so then, when do you make the transition to cannabis? I mean, is there another organization before Simplifya? I mean, is it Simplifya first?
So again, I'm a little bit of a wild card, right? So I decided I wanted to move back to the US and was in Texas, where I'm from, for about a month and was already bored. I was like, I gotta figure out what to do. And to be honest, I hadn't really been keeping up with US going ons while I was abroad. I was very consumed with global geopolitics and stuff that was going on in other countries. And sure. I legitimately had no idea that there was such a thing as legal weed in America, and freaked out when I found out that it was.
What year is this? What year is this?
2016.
2016. So that's already 4 years down the road since Colorado legalized in 2012, yes. Right? Okay.
And so and so that's part of the story is 2 days from that day that I had that revelation, there was an NCIA conference going on in Denver. So I literally, within like 10 minutes, packed my little car up and drove to Denver, rocked up to the conference, and you guys will laugh, but I rocked up in like a suit, just like I would have if I was at the World Economic Forum, and was like, whoa, I shouldn't have done that. But
hey, you're better to overdress than underdress always, right? Isn't that the fashion
it is. And and this is how I actually got involved. Is, you won't believe this, but the very first person I ever spoke to in cannabis was Steve Fox. And who unfortunately passed away early this year. But I was outside literally like talking to myself, like, why did you, Brooke, like, you should have known not to dress up like, your Hillary Clinton pantsuit, coming to a cannabis conference. And he walked over to me and I said probably the dumbest thing I've ever said to anyone out loud, and said, I dressed for 90210 and I should have been dressing for my so-called life. And Steve Fox looked at me, and he was in a suit too, and said, don't worry, we're not all Jordan Catalanos in the industry. Like, we need Andrea Zuckerbergs too. And I was like, awesome. And so he, convinced me to come inside, made me really comfortable. And then fast forward 3 months, and Marion, the CEO of Simplifya, is actually from Sri Lanka. And so I actually just sent him a message on LinkedIn that said, hey, I literally just moved to Denver 2 days ago, saw that you're Sri Lankan and you're in cannabis, would love to talk to you. And the day before that, I had actually spoken to a guy that was like trying to help me decide if I wanted to get into the data side of cannabis or if I wanted to get into the regulatory side. And wouldn't you know, Marion's running a regulatory compliance company. And we had lunch. 5 minutes into the lunch, she's like, you've got to come work for us. Like, we're, 4 people now, like, we're going to like really do this and help the industry kind of navigate these really murky waters. And how this comes back full circle to Steve Fox is Simplifya's co-founders, apart from Marion, was Steve Fox and the Vicente Cederberg law firm out of Colorado. And so it was this really kind of serendipitous, crazy little journey I had into cannabis.
Okay, so lots to unpack there. The first is, when you decided to make that drive from Texas to Colorado, to Denver. You just packed up, you jumped in. Like, what was it that really intrigued you? Was it that this is a burgeoning industry and you were like excited about the next big thing and you want to be involved in it? Or that in addition to you were a consumer as well, you had an affinity for the plant? Like, were you a stranger to the plant or, you know?
Great question. I was far from a stranger to the plant. So I'm obviously a very energetic, high strung kind of person. And when I can still remember the first time I smoked cannabis illegally in Texas in a parking lot when I was probably 23. Sorry, mom. It calmed me down, right? Like I was like, whoa, I'd never found anything that just like kind of let me just settle down. And fast forward a few years, one of my favorite things to do when I lived in Nigeria was to go to the Africa Shrine where Fela Kuti used to play, where his son now plays on Sunday nights. And I used to buy a lot of brickweed, as they would call it, or, from the musicians there.
Right.
But I got malaria 3 times when I was living in Nigeria, or 3 out of the 4 strains. And the third time I got it, I was really, really struggling to recover. I mean, like, I'm a tiny human. I'm tall, but I like tiny width-wise, I guess. And I was under 99 pounds, like could not eat, could not keep food down. And that was making the recovery worse. And my driver, who is still like one of the, like my favorite people like in the world, brought me a brick weed. He went to the Africa Shrine, went and got, when he saw me, I guess, I didn't think he saw me, but I guess he must have seen me getting weed all the time, back to the house and said, this will make you eat. And I was like, I didn't even think of that. Smoked it, roll a joint with newspaper that night, smoked it. And literally I remember cooking pasta and eating all of it and holding it down. Wow. And so the new thing was like at the end of every day, I'd smoke and I would eat. And it was like something that slowly helped me get better. So one, my love for the plant, because I really do feel like it helped save my life, is huge. But 2, yes, exactly what you said about it being a greenfield industry. I mean, I love chaos or organized chaos, right? Clearly. And I was just like, what else or what other opportunity in the US would I get to be able to get in at the ground floor in the first inning of an industry? There's very few industries you can say that opportunity still exists on. And so both of those things really intrigued me like greatly.
Well, and it was a win-win for both parties too, right? So like you're getting what you want because you're being inserted into a new industry where you fit right in with the organized chaos, as you put it, right? And then you have the team at Simplifya that's small, nimble, growing, and you bringing in that different perspective, that different skill set, right? Living abroad, focusing on macroeconomics. I'm sure that played an integral part of, the development in terms of, where you're at today, being the VP of partnerships.
Yeah. I mean, I love figuring out puzzles, right? And every state's regulatory, infrastructure is a different puzzle, unfortunately, in the US right now. And that was really intriguing to me. And the other thing that really drew me in and that has kept me, there for 5 years now is like, I wanted to help find a way for the brave souls, and they are brave, the ones that first got licensed in those states, to be able to navigate, if they're not a lawyer, 500 pages of legal narrative that they're supposed to extrapolate what they can and can't do from. Like, that's not easy, like at all, especially if you've been operating in the illicit side of things for decades.
You're like a Martian coming into a new world. Like, okay, now be compliant, right? And you're like, wait, what? And those people, for the most part, they wanted to become compliant, but where do you even start? Where do you even, what step do you take first? I can imagine it's super overwhelming.
It's the hardest part of my job has been meeting someone that either is looking to get licensed or that was just able to get a license, when they find out all of the things that they have to do just to operate. Like,
and how much money's involved, right, with that.
The biggest thing I have always told people is, because I get asked all the time now, like, hey, I want to open a dispensary in New York. Like, do you think I can do it? And I'm like, well, do you have 10 to $100 million sitting in the bank that you are literally just going to blow through? Like, gone.
Just to get you at the starting line, right? Just to get you to be compliant and to be able to operate.
And yeah, and that's honestly the easiest part of it, which sounds terrible, but it's the truth. Is like, getting the license is actually the easy part. The hardest part is having all of your employees do the same thing every single day, the right way, even when they don't make sense, because some of the rules do not make logical sense sometimes, especially when it's a new state or new city opening for the first time. It's really, really hard to do that, especially when you're in an anti-authoritarian industry by nature, right?
Right.
And people think, oh, this is going to be great, or it's going to be so easy. And it's like, well, you've got to worry about the type of locks that you use, where your security cameras are pointed, where your employees wear their badges on their hips, like weird, silly, nuanced things that you just in any other business wouldn't have to deal with. And I say this a lot as a joke, but it's not fake news, even though everybody's like, are you sure that's true? They've regulated this plant more than plutonium. Like,
that's a fact. That's crazy. So, you're saying legit that is what's going on right now. Plutonium is less regulated than cannabis is.
Sure is. Well, if you're in Oklahoma, you've got it pretty easy. But if you're in any other state, pretty much, it's not so easy. And
Right.
Oklahoma's catching up. So, they'll be up to speed with the likes of California and Massachusetts and Michigan and all these wonderful places anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, and it's so, like, in your perspective, being on the regulatory compliance side and basically, helping these operators navigate through those muddy waters, like, what has been the most surprising thing to you at the state regulatory level? Like, is it that, like, do they miss the mark a lot? And not to point blame, of course, because this is a new industry, but like, is there any thought that goes into, or even collaboration within the industry of like building out these regulations, or not so much? Is it one-sided?
It's very much two-sided in almost all instances, right? But the biggest thing that has surprised me, and unfortunately, I seem to not learn this lesson because I keep thinking it'll be different next time, and it never is well, with some exceptions, is how slow it takes from legalization to licensure to businesses actually operating. Like, I'll use California as the example. First mover advantage in California did not exist. I mean, people were waiting for over a year after they were able to submit their applications to get license approval.
You said first mover advantage
was not necessarily
first. What does that mean?
No, great question. And sorry, I talk in weird terms, so please feel free to stop me at any time. But
you're good.
First mover advantage is kind of, the theory that in business, if you're the first person to market with a product, there's an advantage to that, right?
Right.
Well, in the example of California, the first company to submit an application did not necessarily have an advantage because you were having to pay rent on a facility that you were not allowed to operate yet before you could submit that application. And then you're expecting the state and the cities, and there was one in particular that was extremely slow. Everybody will know that's listening to this, but I won't call out names. But it took forever. And it took so long in California. So that's my dogs barking. See, they don't like them. They're angry too. Like, let's get people like
tell them, Mom. Tell them.
But it just took almost 2 to 3 to 4 times longer than anyone thought to get licensed. And then California had to move to temporary licenses because they couldn't process the annual licenses fast enough, and it was just backlogged. And so that was the biggest surprise.
So it was inefficiency in government that bottlenecked the process of approving these applications.
Bottlenecks, and understaffed, under-resourced, understaffed. Like, I know a lot of people were so upset at like the LA's, LA City and the BCC when it was still the BCC, and all those guys, but they had 3 or 4 people trying to process, thousands of applications, right? Like, and it was just crazy. And you've seen that even from states that move from medical to adult use, how slow that it has even been.
Sorry to cut you off.
Please.
I want to follow up on that. So is that an ongoing problem or repetitive problem in like a state like California, where these specific departments that are focused on specific things within the state are understaffed? Or is it that, maybe the state government's dragging their feet and this passed, through public support, but we're going to kind of put it on the back. It's not a priority for us.
Honestly, I think it's really the latter, right? Or the former, excuse me, where they're understaffed, but I think it was because they underestimated how easy it was going to be. I don't think they realized that all of these rules that they put together, right, that were actually going to be the impediment to them being able to process stuff quickly. I mean, the requirements that you had to submit in the detail of your business plans, your SOPs, your facility, you have to already have a facility you're paying rent on and prove that. Like, to get the license, it was too much. And they had the barriers to entry were too high. And they didn't realize, well, if we did all of that, well, we actually have to review that before we can approve someone's application, right? So It became where this regulations became a burden to both the regulator and the licensees. And not every state has done that, right? You've seen it all different ways, but part of the problem, in California and other states was actually a good thing kind of gone bad, is what I'll say, is like, because I was at every public meeting they had around the rulemaking for not the emergency rules, but for the permanent regulations, as they called them. And they took a lot of input. Well, when you're a regulator that's coming from, let's say, alcohol or gaming, and you've never worked in cannabis, you're not familiar with the plant or the products at all, it's really easy to get lost in all that feedback. And how do you really weed out what's good from bad, right? What's beneficial, what's going to be burdensome? And I'll use this example. We actually thought things were going great. Like, the permanent rules were going to be like, everybody was kind of excited to see them. I mean, not because they had to follow the rules, but let's get the show on the road, right?
Right, yeah.
And when they released them, what no one, not a human in that state, thought was that they were going to ban white labeling, which they did, which California's brands and manufacturers, that's like their business model, right?
Right. They get their flower from one major source that's reliable and does quality growing, and they white label their products, right?
And that was banned. And everyone was like, why did you do this? And I will not say who, but someone from the regulatory body that I asked about it that day, because it was at a conference the day they released it, or the next day. And I said, why in the world did you guys try to ban white labeling? And they said, what's white labeling? And it was just like, oh, and so it's a lot of this not bad intention, right? But this is the growing pains of a brand new industry that they're trying to regulate from scratch.
Yeah, but white labeling's not like super unique to cannabis, is it?
Yeah, I would say no. But again, it's, this is a process, right?
Right.
But here's the beauty, right? And this is why I love the cannabis industry. Where there is a will, there is a way. And within week, within 7 days, there was every law firm, every agency was pumping out memos on, here's the gray area and the workarounds to still be able to do it. And guess what? Well, that's what got some of the rules kind of clarified or straightened out, because they realized, well, this was, one, pointless, and two, like, they're going to find a way to do it. Like,
to that point, it's so funny. Like the find, like, there's a will, there's a way. That's so true. And it makes me kind of chuckle, because it's almost like we're helping our elected officials like write this policy in, because every time they kind of miss the mark, the industry finds its way, and then they have to kind of close that gap off, and then we find
Yep.
another way, and then so if we could all just work together on this, I think that we could be more productive in terms of really laying something out that works for both sides.
Yeah, but the other side of that story, on the behalf of the regulators in their defense, is when you have as many stakeholders as they do, all with different interests, wanting different policies for their own reasons, that makes it even harder for them to figure out what's the right thing to do, right?
Who are those different parties? You mean like the different players within the industry?
Yes. I'll use the example of Colorado and delivery. Okay, this has been my nightmare and everyone's nightmare that's in policy stuff for the last, I don't know, half a decade or more, is it took forever. We just had the very first delivery in Denver last week. Like forever. And I mean, I literally almost cried. I was so happy.
You mean delivery from, so companies are now able to deliver their product directly to the consumer, and you're saying that
through a licensed delivery company in Colorado. But remember, delivery is different in every state as well.
Right. Okay.
And so yes, that happened. But the back and forth of that between the large retailers and the small retailers, well, they wanted different things out of the delivery bill, right? And that causes a lot of problems of, well, how do we do this where we can meet in the middle? And oftentimes meeting in the middle leads to bad policy, right?
Right.
But it gets refined and reformed, and things get easier and get clarified as you go. It's just part of the real struggle that these guys face. It's not easy being a licensed operator by any means in any state.
Totally. And point taken, right? Like their job is not easy in that they have to sort through the complexity of the last 100 years of prohibition and all the regulations that have been in place, right? And accounting for both at the state level and the federal level, right? So right. If it's difficult for them to hear every side and accommodate everyone, which of course is impossible, going with the saying you can't please everyone, right? Where do they fall? Where do they lean? Who do they listen to more than? Who's their go-to?
I would love to know the answer to that, because I think anybody that finds out.
You. I thought it's you.
Oh man, I wish so badly. But I think that it's an interesting question, because I think there's compromises made on both sides on different things, right? So let's say that I was one of the larger retailers in Denver, right? And I fought for one thing, or 5 things. Well, I may end up getting 2 out of the 5 things that I want, and the smaller retailers got 2 different things that they wanted, right? And so there's always this kind of usually this meet in the middle. But again, this is the complexity of cannabis, is that
crazy.
It's different in every city and in every state. And that answer to that question is different in every city and in every state. Some are very straightforward. Some I still don't understand what's going on.
My head spins when you talk, because whenever I talk about the complexity of the cannabis industry at a high level with any guest, when we dive into that, you're literally in the thick of that. That's where you live. You live, I love it. Yep. In the land of complexity. So my hat's off to you. And it's definitely needed. And so you touched on the high barriers to entry, which I think is important to highlight, right? And we've already kind of talked about the obvious, at the beginning, you talked about, just to even get started, the financial burden that you're going to take on, right? So let me ask you this. We talk a lot about social equity in this industry, right? And it's top of mind, both within the industry and at the policy level, local and state and federal, we're talking about it. But because the cost to entry is so high, are we doing enough in terms of some of that legislation to really help people that have been disenfranchised really, be set up for success to enter into this space?
That's the billion-dollar question, right? Is you can create a lower barrier to entry for social equity applicants, or give them help, right? Give them free guidance, get on compliance, on regulatory stuff. But where do they get the money to get the facility? to get all, their workers like paid, to put all of that upfront capital in. And that is where we've started to see some really great incubators and funds pop up that are looking to help, specifically, people that fall into that social equity category that absolutely should have more and better opportunities. But the funding part of it is still the toughest and the saddest thing to see. And that's why, going back to, all the stuff on Twitter, like, yeah, everybody talk about safe banking. And it's like almost annoying, right? You're like, just shut up. Like, it's going to be fine. But that actually is a big piece of the puzzle to this equity thing, because if people can't get access to a bank, they certainly can't get access to regular traditional types of funding.
Totally.
Loans and things like that at any type of normal rate. And unfortunately, what you're seeing, and it really, I get so angry, is people are taken advantage of, and they're put in situations where they're like, well, I was able to get this thing, like, surely, I'm going to work with these people. And like, we've seen it time and time again, people getting bad partners, right? That have the money that say, oh, we're going to help you out because you can get the license, and they leave them high and dry, or something goes bad, or they end up, taking a loan at 30%, not realizing that's the first loan they're going to have to get. Right. And so the funding issues are absolutely imperative to social equity, and it needs to be, figured out. But again, where there's a will, there's a way. You've seen larger companies really start to give back and try to come up with solutions for social equity applicants. You've seen non-traditional funds try to step in and help out. You've seen celebrities or, sports stars try to step in and create these funds to help. And so we need more of that from within the industry to really create a more even playing field, bottom line.
Yeah, a couple of things I want to react to. One is I totally agree with you on the safe banking component. Like, while yes, it's funny and kind of annoying that people talk about it every day, it is super essential to the social equity part of it, right? To everything that you mentioned. And in fact, I know that the Wolf of Wall Street had a back and forth with Cory Booker. I think that he actually
I saw that.
strung a chord with him, and the Wolf was right. I mean, he brought all those points up, right? So your point is very well taken there. And then the second part of it is the education. Before I was kind of on the fence. I had a guest on when I first started this podcast early on. I won't say her name, but she was talking about how the government didn't have any type of how-to programs or regulatory compliance overview programs, or like anything to help educate people that have been disenfranchised, people of color, by the plant. And so at first I would think like, well, is that the government's job? Like, I mean, and in a way, like, can they even take that on? Right. Because of the inefficiencies that we talked about earlier. Right. But it is super important, because along with the fund, like I'm realizing that now, like along with the funding, like this industry is different than any other industry. It is the most highly regulated, complex in the world, right? And so
very, very murky operating environment. Yes.
Right. And so like the average entrepreneur wouldn't have to face this, let alone the average entrepreneur doesn't even probably have like all their ducks in a row in terms of a business plan and this and that. For the most part, you're kind of scrappy when you first start,
and you also don't have to worry about an on average 60% tax rate as an average entrepreneur. You're looking at 21%, which affords you more mistakes. Right. So it's a high stakes game, that cannabis is, because like you are not afforded traditional luxuries that any other, non-Schedule 1 substance plant, industry is privileged to have.
Right.
It's tough. It's really tough.
Not to mention you got to take all the hits and not be able to do tax deductions, right? I mean, IRS 280E, like you can't even
cost of goods sold, and that's it. And even that's a very limited, we're finding out scope of what cost of goods sold really means.
Yeah, it's crazy. So that's why, like, I've always said, cannabis operators are the most resilient business people out there.
Yes, they are. They have backbones of steel, as I like to say.
And they're they don't give up. They just persist. They keep coming at you. They'll figure it out. Delta 8's a perfect example of that.
Yep, absolutely. If you leave a gray area, they are gonna make it clear as day for you on why, like, what that gray area was and where they can go with it. And as they should. Like,
Right.
That's how this thing moves forward. That's how we keep getting reform. That makes it easier and better. And more importantly, and I love every day now, it seems like you're seeing more and more reports that actually have data to back up the fact that, like, the kids aren't dying in the streets,
Right.
the loot, like, there's not trash everywhere all over the city if you legalize cannabis.
Right. I tweeted a Yahoo article about cannabinoid therapeutics. They published it yesterday, which was August 30th. Like, wow. Yahoo's talking about how cannabis is beneficial health wise. Like, that's incredible.
The times they are changing, as they say, and that helps make the regulatory burden less onerous, because if they realize that it's not going to blow up and be the end of the world, well, then you don't need to have all of these insane 500 pages of, yes or no, like, what can I do? What can I not do? Regulations. I mean, it should only get better as we move forward. But why I love this industry so much and why I'm part of the MSO gang and everything else is, like, the people that have figured out how to operate in this environment are only going to get bigger and better once they're in an easier environment. Like, this is the toughest environment you could possibly be on. You're out in the middle of the ocean on a little bitty boat with, like, 30-foot waves. Like, ain't no chance. Like, but some people are surviving, and they're not only surviving, like, they're thriving. Right. Like, it's really, really been beyond my expectations how much people have been able to do despite the odds stacked against them.
Totally. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Brooke, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about Simplifya. So I'd love to talk about, the specific tools and features and functionality within the platform and how it helps operators stay compliant.
Yeah. So, Simplifya was really created because, like I said, after Colorado went from medical to medical and adult use, what the Vicente Cedarberg law firm realized was that every 3 or 6 months, they were getting asked to go out to their client's facility to do, like, a third-party audit, right? Walk through with a clipboard of all, 350 plus regulations that these guys have to follow and see if they were actually compliant or not. Because you don't want to get dinged or lose money after you've just spent $1 million to get up and running, right?
Right.
And they would give them the report. They'd say, hey, these 20 things need to be fixed, blah, blah, blah. They'd come back in 6 months and the owners would be like, well, I didn't fix those things because I didn't know how to. Like, and they were just like, whoa, like, this is kind of crazy. Like, we've got to create an easy to use, affordable solution. So, these guys that want to be compliant and aren't wanting to just, be rebels without a cause, really find a way to navigate and keep track of, their compliance issues and, be able to remediate it and have a record of that, because we wanted to create basically like a Carfax report, right, of your business. Because if you're able to show that, like, hey, I've been trying my best, in good faith, and, when we find issues, we fix them. One, more often than not, the regulators are going to be willing to work with you. I mean, at the end of the day, they want your tax revenue.
Right.
Right. So they want you to succeed. Let's put it that way. But they want you to, follow the rules. But you've got to prove to them that, you're doing, your best to do that. And so, that was kind of initially where we started, is we wanted a really accessible technology solution that would kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of dumb down the regulations so that anyone, whether they're a lawyer or not, whether they're a $17 an hour bud tender, or they're the owner of a company, could understand what they can and cannot do in the very tightly regulated scope of their specific job. And so we started with self-audits. It was a self-auditing tool. And it was, I always say that we were a toddler back then, it was very basic, and, we had a lot of room to grow. And, We started in Colorado, and when we launched into California, when we read through the licensing requirements, we realized that there was a really big burden put on the applicants around standard operating procedures. And so we thought, well, how can we simplify that and make it into, again, an affordable way for anyone that's trying to get a license to be able to meet that part of the requirement? And so yep.
Is that where Simplifya was born? Because you thought, how do we simplify that?
Marion will tell you, apparently, Marion is a tech entrepreneur, and he will tell you that the appropriate way to name a tech company is to take a normal word and make it weird. And so, yes. So I was telling everybody, we're not trying to complify the rules. We're trying to simplify.
There you go. Yeah.
But yeah, yep, great question. But yeah, and so we tried to simplify the regulations into these SOP templates that covered every single, there was like 40 or 50, I forget, I don't remember, different SOP requirements, from like how to dispose of cannabis waste, silly things like that you wouldn't think of really, right? Unless you really knew, which nobody did. And then make them specific to each license type, right? So if you're a retailer, we had a retail bundle. If you were looking to get a cultivation license, we had a cultivation bundle.
That's like a playbook that's just like they would just need to kind of operate right from, without having to take that extra time to do the research and searching and learning. Yeah.
Like we took the nasty part off of their plate. So we went through the rules and said, hey, here's a template that you've still got some work to do on, but you get to do the fun part. You get to layer in your company's special sauce, right? And on top of all of these wonderful regulations that you have to follow, right?
Right.
And so that was kind of the second thing that we launched. We rolled into California. And then also because of California, so all the states can thank California for this, but we also created a digital filing cabinet that we call the Smart Cabinet that comes pre-populated with a cheat sheet of every single document that you have to keep, which in California, they think that there was like 90 or something crazy like that. Again, there's like 5 in Oklahoma, so it's very different per state, right?
And if you didn't have that digital like option, you're just basically storing away 95 sheets of paper somewhere
for 7 years, right?
For 7 years.
One of the jokes,
totally reasonable, right?
Yeah. Totally reasonable. And one of the jokes that my clients made, and this was like kind of what really helps us start it, was he was like, I'm gonna have to buy a whole other facility just for filing cabinets. Like, it's just crazy because you have to keep your visitor logs for every month, your shipping logs, your manifest, like every single little thing that you could think of, like they want to keep and track. And so again, just trying to make it easier for them. And we track, we have a license tracker that tracks their city licenses, their state licenses, their employee badges, their insurance policies, their vehicles, anything that expires, like a fire extinguisher, because lo and behold, they expire once a year, apparently. We just try to take all of that kind of really boring, nasty part of the business that nobody got into cannabis to do off of their plates so they can focus on creating world-class products, right? Like that's what they should be doing. And so again, that's kind of where we started. And now we actually have different products that target financial institutions such as credit unions and insurance companies that are willing to work in the cannabis space, that helps verify licenses, because they have to have some way to make sure that if they're going to work in cannabis, that they're not working with people that are not in the legal market. Right. And so we have a product called Simplifya Verified that we're really proud of, that we stood up last year, that really helps with that. And that hopefully will continue to get more banks to see it's not as crazy or as difficult or as scary to actually provide banking services to the cannabis space. So that's, again, big passion of mine. So we did that. And then we just, as of a month ago, or I guess a month ago, announced that we are actually standing up our own payments platform as well to do compliant payment processing.
Wow.
Extremely excited about that as a consumer. The only reason I have cash on me ever is because I'm going to a dispensary, and I'd love to not have to like worry about driving through an ATM before I get to the dispensary, right? Like, and I don't know how much I'm going to buy, right? So like,
Right.
sometimes it prevents me from buying products I think are cool because I'm like, well, I don't want to go take out another $100 and pay another fee. So as a consumer, I'm selfishly very excited that we're launching that. But that should really help with like delivery services and things like that, because that's finally a part of the industry you're starting to see take off in a lot of different states now. Thank you, COVID. That's one good thing that came out of that.
Exactly. Pandemic Pro.
Yep. And so that's new. And it's called Tender without an I. So it's TENDR.
Tender. Well, no, it's amazing to see the evolution of Simplifya, how you started from, like you said, the SOP work to moving into the more meticulous regulatory action items that most business operators don't even want to deal with, right? To now where you're moving into the financial part of it, right? The point of sale system, being able to process payments, which is desperately needed. And you also mentioned Simplifya Verified. That's the institutions. And I think that, because there are one-off institutions in different states that work with cannabis companies, not the larger institutions, but it sounds like y'all are a great catalyst to get some of those other private institutions over the fence, and not, like you said, be so scared of banking within the sector.
We're trying, and there's other companies out there that are really trying hard too. I'll think of like Shield Compliance and Green Check Verified. Like there are people that are trying to fill that gap and really bring people from the financial world into the fold, because we understand like that is one of the biggest challenges and impediments to these guys growing their business. Like it is, can you imagine operating, $1 million a day in transactions and that all being in cash?
And think about the crime. Think about the crime also, like the vulnerability you're putting yourself in. I come from a small town, and the local politics there, they talked at a city council meeting about cannabis ordinance, and the police chief said right away, first and foremost, we need to think about protecting these business operators because it is a cash business, right? Like, so
I spent my first year in California, and I'm not kidding you, half of my job, it felt like, was picking up brown paper sacks full of cash. And that's crazy. Again, like that actually reminds me of a great point. Like we're a month to month, like traditional, software as a service model, right? But people were paying us a year in advance because they were like, I was like, there's no way I can drive up to Santa Rosa and back down to San Diego every month, and that's not fair. People should be able to pay
for their monthly payments. You mean you had to go collect?
I was like, you have to pay, like, if I'm going to come pick up a bag of cash, like it needs to be for a year. But that was scary for me as like a single female driving around with like tens of thousands of dollars in your car. Like at no point in that entire journey did I ever feel safe.
Never. Ever. No. Right. So hopefully those elected officials, I don't know if they're listening to this, but if we can spread the word, that's one area also why safe banking is so important, in addition to the social equity component and other reasons, obvious reasons why.
It's unnecessary violence that does not have to take place. And they can put all of the security requirements, and believe me, they have, into the rules. But if people know that there is $1 million in your vault, or in vaults that you've got hidden all around your facility or whatever, all over the city, like they are going to try to find it, especially if you give them a window to do that and they spot a weakness in your armor, if you will. And like, there is a very preventable and solvable issue. Access to a regular bank account, like novel idea, right?
Who would have thought? Who would have thunk it? It's crazy. Yeah. Brooke, it's been a pleasure listening to you, hearing your insights, learning about your background and all the great work that you do within Simplifya. Anything you want to leave the audience with before we wrap up?
I would just say, if you are in the industry, thank you, because you guys have traveled the road that's less traveled and the hardest terrain on earth. And if you're, looking to get in the industry or service the industry, yes, it's daunting and it can feel overwhelming, but you're standing on the backs of giants, right? Like a lot of people have gone through a lot of things to help figure out and make this a little bit easier. And I think you see it all the time on the cannabis Twitter that we're in the second or third inning of this ball game, and it's absolutely true. And so you're not too early, you're not too late. It's going to be a wild ride, and it's, I think, one worth being on if you've got the stomach for it. And I've loved every second of it. I mean, I wake up and every day is different, which is, most days good, some days very frustrating. But it's a wonderful community of people. I've never felt so inspired and so welcomed by a group of people I didn't know at all 5 years ago that now are like family to me. And so, take the risk, jump in. We want you in the fold, and we want you to help us grow and bring your innovations from outside of the cannabis industry into our industry, and help keep improving things and make things more efficient for all of us.
I love it. I couldn't agree more, Brooke. Yeah, well said. Where can people find y'all's social media or website information if they wanted to learn more about Simplifya?
So the good news is it's all just going to be Simplifya. So, Instagram, Twitter,
you were lucky
Facebook.
enough to grab them all right away. You didn't
I guess
have the underscore wasn't needed.
Nobody typoed Simplifya, I guess, before, on accident, but it's just for everybody wondering, how do you spell Simplifya? It's literally just simplify and then add an A on the end.
Done. That's the easiest way to do it. Perfect.
Yep.
Brooke Butler, thank you so much again. Really enjoyed it. Let's run it back again real soon as y'all continue to grow and evolve and add value to the industry. Okay.
Yeah, I'd love to. Honestly, thank you so much. Like, this was a blast.
Awesome. Yes, same for me. And thank you all for listening. Bye.